First, I have Renée Ahdieh. Hi, Renée.
Hi.
Renée is the author of the #1 New York Times bestselling The Wrath and the Dawn and The Rose and the Dagger. She is passionate about all kinds of curry, rescue dogs, and college basketball. The first few years of her life were spent in a high-rise in South Korea. Consequently, she enjoys having her head in the clouds. She lives in Charlotte, North Carolina with her husband and their tiny overlord of a dog, and her next book is The Beautiful. Welcome, Renée.
Thank you. Thank you.
Next, we have Lauren Shippen. Lauren is a writer and actor with experience in podcasts, films, and books. She's the creator and head writer of the Bright Sessions podcast, one of iTunes' best of 2016. She was named one of Forbes 30 Under 30 in Media 2018 and one of Movie Maker magazine and Austin Film Festival's 25 screenwriters to watch. Lauren was born in New York City and grew up in Bronxville, New York. She currently lives in Los Angeles, but still travels frequently to New York. Her next book is The Infinite Noise. Welcome, Lauren.
Thank you.
Next, we have Katy Pool. Katy was born and raised in Los Angeles, California. After graduating from UC Berkeley with a degree in history, she spent a few years building websites by day and dreaming up prophecies by night. Currently, she resides in the San Francisco Bay Area, where she can be found eating breakfast sandwiches, rooting for the Golden State Warriors, and reading books that set her on fire. There Will Come a Darkness is her first novel, publishing in the fall. Nicole Conway is the author of the international best-selling fantasy series, The Dragon Rider Chronicles and Dragon Rider Legacy. She's currently working on the third and final series, The Dragon Rider Trials, set to launch in 2020. Her other published works include Mad Magic, Distance Between Stars, and Scales. Nicole was born in Alabama, but has spent a large part of her life traveling around the world with the military. She graduated from Auburn University, has worked extensively in graphic art and design, and now enjoys writing as a full-time career. For the moment, Nicole lives in Tucson with her husband and son, and is often found at indoor rock climbing gyms or sneaking away to buy another reptile to add to her growing collection. Next we have... Next we have Sherrilyn Kenyon, the New York Times bestselling author who is a regular in the #1 spot. More than 60 million copies of her books are in print in more than 100 countries. Her current series include DEADMAN'S CROSS, The Dark Hunters, The League, and Chronicles of Nick. Her Chronicles of Nick and Dark Hunter series are soon to be major media productions. Welcome, Sherrilyn. And last but not least, we have Marissa Meyer. Marissa is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of Renegades, Arch Enemies, the Lunar Chronicles series, as well as the graphic novels Wires and Nerve Volume 1 and Wires and Nerve Volume 2, Gone Rogue, and the Lunar Chronicles coloring book. Her first standalone novel, Heartless, was a #1 New York Times bestseller. She lives in Tacoma, Washington, with her husband and their 2 daughters. Welcome, Marissa. Well, thank you guys so much for being here. I'm really excited to talk fantasy with you all. We have a really great assortment of different kinds of fantasies on this panel, and I was wondering if we could start with you sort of outlining where your books are set, what the world is like, and what the hardest thing was to figure out about it. And I guess, let's say the book you have coming out next, or that came out most recently, you can choose. The Beautiful's here, so let's do The Beautiful.
We can do The Beautiful. It's really exciting for me because I love bringing new worlds to life, especially across the globe and all throughout history. My first series was based in a fantasy sort of like ancient Persia, and my second series was based in a fantasy feudal Japan. And with this series, The Beautiful, it's a vampire murder mystery set in 1872 New Orleans, which is really exciting for me because it's the time immediately following the Civil War and before we sort of codified racism into our laws with Jim Crow. And there's a little blip of time, if you look at history, especially in New Orleans, in which they had an integrated police force. For a brief amount of time, Louisiana had a governor who was mixed race. He was half black, half white. And I really loved to explore this time period because it sort of like showed me what might have happened if we hadn't allowed Jim Crow laws to settle in place. And I'm a child of mixed heritage, so being able to write about people who are also mixed heritage has been really amazing for me with this series.
Wow, I want to just take that book and go read, and you guys can do the panel.
It's going to happen a lot today.
So my book takes place very much in the real world. It's about, it's based off my podcast, The Bright Sessions, which is about people with supernatural abilities in therapy. And the thing for me that I've always loved about fantasy is taking real people, real characters with real problems, and giving them fantastical or supernatural problems or worlds to live in. And so for me, with building this world, it was really about finding the quirks within my own world that I could transform into something fantastical. So the main sort of superpowered person in this book, Caleb Michaels, is an empath. He can feel the emotions of everyone around him. And so taking something that is a universal human experience of having emotions and heightening it by putting it into sort of a magical realist, superpowered lens was something that was really, really fun to do.
So my book, There Will Come a Darkness, is very much a second world fantasy. So it takes place in essentially a magical sort of ancient Mediterranean, ancient Greece, ancient Alexandria type of world. And within this world, there used to be the 7 prophets whose prophecies helped guide the world. And I think one of the difficulties and kind of most interesting things about writing this world was thinking about what the world was like when these prophets existed versus when the book takes place and the prophets are all gone and the prophecies are gone and the people in the world are sort of left without that guidance. And so I'm like such a history nerd. So I definitely built in a lot of like the history of the world from sort of the beginning of these prophets to the present.
So it's kind of a running joke that I am incapable of writing books without dragons in them. And my book, Legend, that just came out, finished off the 2nd Dragon Rider series. All of them are set in a medieval fantasy, very Lord of the Ringsy type world with magic and elves and dragons. And my challenge in taking that on was, of course, adding an element to it that hadn't been seen before, hadn't been tilled that soil before. And so my approach to it was very much to take the angle of, okay, if this were real, if dragons really existed in medieval times, how would we really train dragon riders? What would they really wear? What would their armor look like? How would they be trained to use it? How would they actually fight in combat and make sure that they didn't torch their own soldiers as well as the enemy? So the series follows the main character Javid through his training, where he's actually learning to be a dragon rider. How do they steer in the air with their saddles? And I have to thank my husband who's sitting right there. He's a pilot, and he helped me develop a lot of the, I guess, medieval tech that they use in the series, and to make it plausible. So that was the challenge that I set forth.
I kind of write some of everything. Like with the Lords of Avalon, I do high Arthurian fantasy. My League series is sci fantasy, so it's set in a science fiction universe. The Dark Hunters are urban fantasy. So, and some of the Dark Hunters are set in ancient Greece. Some are Egyptian fantasy. So I kind of play in a big, huge palette. I go wherever my muses tend to take me. But I'm also older than dirt. I'm not nearly as young as the people who are up here. So I've had a lot more years to kind of explore my universes.
So my current series, the Renegades trilogy, is my take on a superhero story. And in it, there's 2 factions. There's the Renegades, who are the superheroes, and the Anarchists, who are the supervillains. And in the course of the story, one of the Anarchists, a girl named Nova, starts to fall in love with a renegade. And so it's very much this, conflict between good and evil, but also what does it mean to be good? What does it mean to be evil? And so one of the biggest challenges that I found in writing this is, of course, there are already so many superhero stories and comics. There's a very rich history of superhero stories around us, which was great to be able to draw on that for inspiration. But then it ended up being a huge challenge trying to come up with, well, what are some superpowers that Marvel hasn't already done a billion times? And there were so many times when I would come up with a superpower that I thought, oh, that's so cool, that's so interesting, so unique. Surely nobody's thought of that one yet. And then you go and you Google it, and you're like, nope, Marvel's done it 6 times. So that was definitely one of my bigger challenges.
So you're wrapping up the trilogy this fall. I'm wondering what the feeling was for you of finishing this particular series and really closing that kind of chapter and bringing all those arcs to an end.
Shock and relief, mostly. The Renegades, it was originally going to be one book, a standalone book. And And as I was writing it, it kept getting longer and longer and more complicated, and more characters started coming into it. And about 200,000 words into the manuscript, I realized, oh, maybe this is 2 books. And so we made it 2 books, and working on the second one, and it gets longer and longer and more complicated. And at some point, I'm like, maybe it's a trilogy. So when finally I was working on the 3rd book and realized that yes, it is definitely going to end, there's an end in sight, I was happy to know that I was going to be able to close it and do in a way that I thought would be really satisfying and kind of tie everything together that I'd been working on. So it's always a great feeling to finish a series. And there's that huge sense of accomplishment, and you can't wait for the readers to get it in their hands to see how everything turns out. And at the same time, though, I'm always very excited to move on to the next project, because there's always a million things calling for me.
Yeah. What about the rest of you? As you're building these worlds, do you find that they keep getting bigger, more complicated, and you keep finding new areas to explore?
Yeah, the Bright Sessions we wrapped up last year because it's a very insular story, and I wanted to make sure that we didn't sort of fall into the trap of, oh, well, we can keep telling more stories, so we should. And that, everybody's watched a TV show that after sort of season 4 or 5, you're like, oh, you should have maybe ended this TV show. But what I ended up doing instead was writing 3 books and making a spin-off, and one of a couple spin-offs. And so I think for me, it's been figuring out how to best tell these different pockets of stories, like as you kind of come up against a character or a part of your world that, for me at least, feels like almost a discovery rather than a creation, figuring out how best to tell that story. I just finished my 2nd book, which is the second in the Bright Sessions trilogy, which they're not related to each other necessarily. And the 2nd book is a prequel, and so I was like, okay, this is 10 years before, I kind of know where this character's story goes. This is going to have a clear ending. But the problem was I created all these other characters, and I'm like, well, what if I just did an entire series about this one person? And so I think for me, there's always that temptation of wanting to just continue to tell a story, but it's really about figuring out like what's the best way to tell it and what stories actually need to be told.
Katie, what about you coming into your first book and introducing the world to readers?
Yeah, so this is a trilogy, and I had always wanted to write a fantasy with just like a huge world. Like I love like Game of Thrones and like anything where it seems like, the more you see of the world, the more that there is. And that was definitely my experience writing it too. Writing the first book, I sort of had to set up the big world, but we're really focused on a few key places where the characters are. And now I'm working on the 2nd book, and there's all these things that I sort of threw into the first book that I'm like, this sounds cool, like there's this city, and we're actually visiting those cities in the 2nd book. So now I'm trying to figure out like, oh, I mentioned this stuff about this city, like how does it actually all come together, and really exploring that. And so going into my 2nd book, I was like, oh, I already know this world. I spent, so much time world building it, but the truth was I did not know everything about it. So discovering more and more as I write and revise has been really fun.
Yeah. Nicole, with your Dragon Rider series, you're targeting slightly younger readership. How does that maybe change or impact the way you write your fantasy and build your world?
So yeah, when I started out, my goal was to really write to an age group that was much of the upper middle grade to middle grade, and it is a bit of a challenge. The rules are a bit different. You obviously have to keep the romance very, very mild. But what I've found is that, especially when it comes to deep epic fantasy like that, is a lot of these kids have a very high reading comprehension level, and they crave the details and the intricate plots and the well-developed characters and that are harder to find in younger literature in a clean way. Yeah. So I still write the books as though I'm writing a book that I would read. I just really, really scale back on the kissing and the violence and all of that. You have to kind of, do the 80s fade to black. But that's, to me, why I love this genre so much, is because it still lets me use that part of my creativity to really develop and dive deep into some hard questions that kids do ask. They may not ask their parents, but they are asking these questions internally, and to present it in a safe, clean, mom-approved environment.
Sherrilyn, over your career, you've written paranormal, romance, you've written urban fantasy, historical. Do you have a favorite, and how do you work fluidly between all those different subgenres?
No. That's one of the reasons why I do it. No, I mean, in terms of that, as a reader, I read everything. I'll read a cereal box if there's nothing else. So when I grew up, I grew up, in the middle of 8 boys, and my mother was a huge horror fan. So I actually started out in the horror genre. And The Dark Hunter started out as horror short stories, which people didn't know. One of my favorite rejections that I got on the League series, which ended up, some of those were published under romance. But when they were first published, the short stories, they were done as military SF, and I had a huge following at one time back in the early 80s. I am that old, oh my God. But I remember that one of the editors, who will remain nameless, was, oh my God, I want these books, I want the art. Have you done a complete novel yet? And of course, at the time I was 18, 19 years old, I'm like, no, but yes, I will get that to you. And about the time I got it drafted, I sent it in to him, and I was writing under a male pseudonym because back then they were like military SF, you're a woman. Well, I was a kid, like I knew what I was doing. I sent it in to him, and he immediately said, we don't do women's fiction here. Send it over to somebody else. But you requested it. So that's probably my favorite rejection of all time. Anyway. So interesting things when you've been in the business quite this long, but yeah. No, the hardest thing is to ever, when you go from one book to another the way I do, you do the mom thing where it's like, what was that character's name? Bill, Bob, yay. So yeah, occasionally I will type and those who've read Night Play where Fang is Fury in the back seat, I did that. I'm sorry, that's a mom moment. That's the big challenge, is remembering what? I know your name, I just forgot it for a moment. But you'll be in trouble as soon as I remember it.
I mean, one of the most exciting things about this panel is that it is a panel of all women and writing really unique and interesting fantasies. I think that's really important. And I think, this is a moment where sort of politics is a little inescapable. And I think there's a lot of political potential in fantasy. Renee, starting with you, how do you want to use your fantasy world to explore political questions? You touched on it briefly when talking about The Beautiful, but what kinds of questions do you want to talk about and things like that?
I think absolutely. I don't remember who said it. It was probably a very wise white man. But he said that writing a book is a political act. And I think invariably, even if you start a series, I first fall in love with worlds, and then I fall in love with the characters. And for me, the characters are what take me through, especially if it's a series, multiple books. I think with respect to politics, your personal worldview infiltrates every aspect of whatever you write, whether or not you do it intentionally. And I think for me, especially writing for young adults, what I wanted to do with The Beautiful, and this is so funny because I'm watching, it's almost like this story unfolding before me too, because this book is sort of like spreading as like time passes, and I'm waiting for the moment when it slaps on the table really loudly, and I'm trying to catch it before it happens. So it's like this, I don't know if it's happening over here with Lauren, but it's hilarious, and I'm trying to make sure it doesn't happen when anyone else is talking, but it's almost like tension unfolding, and I'm like, yes, I'm living for this, as a sort of interjection. But again, with respect to politics, and specifically with my books writing for young adults, I really wanted to see more feminist iterations of stories that I had loved as a child, which is, like for instance, Twilight, which is one of the inspirations for The Beautiful because it's a vampire murder mystery. I really wanted to take a more feminist, sort of inclusive approach to a story that I found incredibly captivating when I was writing it. We can talk about the merits and demerits of Edward. He's a stalker. But I mean, I still loved the sort of like the quality that made me want to turn the pages, and I wanted to do that from a lens, and I never intentionally stepped into writing books with inclusive characters, like saying to myself that's what I was going to do. It was just a world in which I lived, and I didn't see a lot of these books when I was growing up, so I was like, dare I write them? So.
Yeah, I want to echo everything that Renee said. I think that especially the idea that regardless of what you're trying to do, your beliefs are always going to find their way into your stories, and people are going to take that as they take that. The Bright Sessions gets accused of being political and pushing a liberal agenda a lot, simply because it has multiple queer characters. And a lot of people have come to me on the internet and said that's unrealistic. And I'm like, oh, okay. I mean, there's not one queer person in the world. And it's especially interesting because myself and a lot of the cast members and team are queer, so it's actually like, it represents the balance of the people making it, and people still find that to be unrealistic, that all those people would be in one place. And it's the same thing with, a female-led sci-fi show, things like that. And something that this book specifically I wanted to explore, just because it's an idea that I find interesting, is masculinity, and both positive masculinity and toxic masculinity, because it's such a huge driver of both good and bad things in the world. And having a character at the center who is a football playing jock who is feeling the feelings of everybody around him in high school and falling in love with a male classmate of his, and what that kind of, taking that trope of the jock character and giving him some complications and some depth. And then also in terms of sort of creating a fantasy world that reflects my political beliefs. I definitely sometimes, I think, especially given that I started Bright Sessions in 2015 and then, 2016 happened, I oftentimes find myself putting in, the world that I want to live in. And so in this book, there is, a little bit of bullying, but there's not really a lot of homophobia or coming out angst. And it's not to say that those stories aren't important or that doesn't exist in the world, but there are so many wonderful stories about the struggles of coming out. And I wanted to tell a story just about falling in love, and that love story happens to be between two boys, and so that was kind of a reflection of the world that I want to live in versus the world as it is.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and definitely what you said. I also feel like fantasy is just such a valuable place to really interrogate the way that our world works, because when you're building a different world, you don't have to follow that same blueprint. Like, you can really look at the way that certain things in our world do, like homophobia, and think about, well, my world doesn't need that. Maybe that doesn't exist in my world. And so that was something that I was definitely wanting to do with There Will Come a Darkness, where sort of these really entrenched social biases that we have in our world that have come up for various reasons, like their history is different, they don't have those things. And so that was a really fun place for me to sort of escape to and to write in, especially during this period of time.
So you may have heard at the beginning, I'm from Alabama, which is not a great place to be from if you're a woman right now. But especially in the second series, the first series, putting elements of myself, and I struggle with female narrators. Don't know why, I just do. But I needed a female narrator. So one of the main characters and narrators from the second series was Jenna. And what I wanted to accomplish through her was that up to that point in the kingdom's history, women were not allowed to be dragon riders. But her daddy's the king. So if she wants to be a dragon rider, it's going to happen. Also, the Dragon Rider Academy has a fundamental rule that if a dragon chooses you voluntarily as a rider, they have to let you in. And she's chosen. So she is dealing through the story. I didn't realize how much of myself I was pouring into her until I actually listened to it on Audible and was like, wow, I didn't mean to do that. But she's really struggling with the backlash that she's getting from her father, who has raised her listening to stories of grandeur and battle. He's raised this little girl who to think that dragon riders and knights are awesome, and then he's shocked when she wants to be one and doesn't approve. And then she joins, and of course she's bullied, but she also makes lifelong friends, and that's the group that she winds up fighting with through the duration of the series, and finding that niche for her where she does belong, and realizing that, yes, I am meant to do this. This is supposed to be who I am. And that was just incredibly validating for me, even, just to write that validation of wanting these things that society has told you no for so long. And I like to shed the light on issues and through my characters that are kind of lesser known, I guess. And so in my series Scales, the main character, his name is Koji, and he is a military child. And I like to call military children professional nomads, because these are kids who are ripped out of their schools and their houses and their little, group of friends every 2 years. So they don't learn to make lasting friendships. They learn to be the new kid, make new friends, and then you leave. And so that's been Koji's life. And he's starting, a new high school, and his dad's a pilot, and his mom passed away. So his dad has tried to bear the burden of being both parents for him, and but shedding the light on how hard it is for these kids, because we witness that, how they struggle with being the new kid all the time, for always having to reinvent themselves every time they move. And that's just not something that I had ever seen portrayed accurately in a book before. And I was like, I need that. And the kids need that. And the adults who've grown up that way need that. And so Koji is probably, for that reason, my favorite character of all. Plus, he's a super nerd like I was in school. And his dad's an engineer, and he likes to do art, so his dad totally doesn't get that. And that was me as a child. But for that reason, I've tried to add those elements and shed the light on some of those issues that are kind of quiet or in the background. But
Well, to reiterate, we are products of how we were raised in our environments, and my sister was one of the original bra-burning liberal, Gloria Steinem followers, and, I grew up in that environment, but I also grew up, as I said, in the middle of 8 boys. So the one thing I know is that while you do have that where there were struggles that women had, there's a lot of stuff that goes on with boys. One of the things that I started the Chronicles of Nick with is I've noticed that with my sons, especially coming up through school, there's a lot of weird bullying that's going on now with little boys who are coming up in our school systems that a lot of people, I don't think, especially if you don't have a son, are aware of. And one of the messages that I wanted to get through, particularly with Chronicles of Nick, is what people, without realizing, trying to correct that pendulum swing of what the girls my age or a little bit older and younger went through. You don't correct bullying by bullying another group. And so I was trying to shed, we're really kind of brutal on young men today. So I really wanted to drive that home with even trying to get the Chronicles of Nick published. That was one of the biggest things that I had with my publisher at the time. They didn't want me to do a male protagonist. They're like, boys don't read. I'm like, well, one of the reasons boys aren't reading is you're not giving them someone that they can get behind. A lot of the books that are being published, tend to be very focused on girl characters, and that's wonderful, and boys should be reading the girl characters, but they tend to be very negative for boys. And so when the boys are trying to read them, they're like, well, we're getting bashed a lot. And that's why a lot of the teen boys don't want to read a lot of the quote girl fiction, is that they feel when they're trying to read these empowering heroines that they're getting knocked in the head. And I'm like, you can write a series that focuses on both positive for boys and girls. And, that was one of the things when my son came home one day, he's like, Mom, if you don't write me something with zombies, I swear to God, I'm going to lactate. And I was impressed. First, he was 10 years old. He knew that word. And I looked at my son and I said, okay, zombies it is. He's like, and kill it with a pencil. So, and I went to work immediately on Chronicles of Nick. I said, okay, we gotta kill a zombie with a pencil. My son said so. And it took me like 4 years to get it published, but, so, yeah. And then in terms of doing the other, political stuff, I've tried to do it in fantasy, but for some reason, my mind doesn't work that way. Mine tends to come out more in my lead series. And I think it's because as a little girl, I grew up with a lot of military. And I used to listen to my dad and my uncles sit around going, they were all Vietnam and Korea vets, going, if I ran the war, this is how I'd do it. And so it's like assassin politics. Yeah. That's what you do. You kill the people who annoy you and you get paid for it. We're gonna set up an assassin world where if I don't like you, not only do I pay somebody to do it, I tell them exactly how I want your carcass to be found. Which tells you way too much more about me than you probably need to know. That and the first book I wrote when I was 8 years old was about a little girl who killed 8 brothers and got away with it. Because she did it psychically. But yeah, but in those, it is more fun, I think, when you're in a science fiction setting, because you do get to do things like, okay, we're going to have a world with no boys. We're going to have a world with no girls. They're going to meet, and this is going to be fun, because now they have to fight it out. And so, yeah, that's why I love the sci-fi fantasy stuff so much. Anyway, I will go now.
No, I love these blanket statements that publishers make. The boys don't read books, or people won't buy a book with a person of color on the cover, or girls don't read science fiction. Like these things that they just decide is the truth, and then some book will come out and blow everyone away, and then all the publishers are scrambling to be like, wait, we didn't know people wanted that. Who knew? Anyway, politics. I feel like with me, I never go into writing a book thinking, oh, I have this belief or this message that I'm trying to convey, and I'm going to try to convince all my readers, to think this way or to see the world in this way. The goal ultimately is, of course, to write a compelling story and interesting characters and to entertain people for a few hundred pages. But inevitably, you do have, you're a product of your environment, a product of your world, and it's impossible not to write stories with, that infiltrating the story. And so a lot of times for me, it's not until I'm, even maybe in my second or third draft of a book when I start to realize, like, oh, there's these really big themes about prejudice and ostracism and bullying and two political factions that are, completely dividing the world and nobody is communicating at all and it's screwing everything up. And then you're like, oh, I see where that came from. And so it definitely starts to play a part, but it's never something that I'm really thinking about consciously as much as it is something that just kind of infiltrates into the stories that I'm telling more organically.
Renee, with The Beautiful, you're coming off of Flame in the Mist, and you're dealing with vampires now. Given that vampires have had such a storied history in YA, I'm wondering, were there things that you were particularly inspired by, maybe tropes you wanted to avoid, things like that?
There are a lot of tropes I really love, actually. And I think that I find comfort in a trope that's very well done. And I think often what people find issue with is a trope that they feel like is sort of like shop worn, there's nothing original about it, it's predictable. For me, I think telling a story that's well loved, all of my favorite YA books are some sort of iteration of The Count of Monte Cristo and Romeo and Juliet. So, what I'm looking for is something original, make me fall in love with your characters. And I think that with The Beautiful, I fell in love with vampire fiction when I was 12 years old. I was caught reading a book in math class, and so that my math teacher called my parents, and my dad sort of called me down into his office, and he had this big wall of books behind him, and he was like, you can read anything on these shelves if you stop reading in math class, except for this row of books at the top. I was 12. Obviously, that night, I got a stool, and I climbed to the top of the thing, and I chose a book that had a bad word in the title, because if I was going to be bad, I was going to be really bad. And it was Queen of the Damned by Anne Rice. And I read that book, and I read that book underneath my blanket with a flashlight that didn't work properly, so it would fade out and I'd have to click it, which was perfect. The ambiance was just great for that. And that was the time I actually fell in love with writing. I had always been an avid reader, but I wanted to write something that was equally transportive. And I wanted to totally immerse somebody in a different world. So I fell in love with the Vampire Chronicles, and then it was sort of over for me after that. I've always been really passionate about vampires and Gothic fiction. And I love this period in time, the Victorian era. And again, I loved sort of exploring the difficulty of the country immediately following the Civil War. It just had every piece that I really and again, the feminist aspect too, for me, I mean, the inciting incident in this book, obviously this is unintentionally a reflection of what's going on now, is my main character, Celine, kills the boy who tried to rape her. And that, I mean, that action too, in a world set in the 19th century, that's an action that for which she could be hanged for. And she doesn't think anyone is gonna believe her. And the sad truth is, you look at the current state of politics and the current state of, like civil rights and feminism, that's still a real fear for, and most young women, most women in general, I mean, it's 3 out of 5 women are, survivors of some kind of sexual assault. That's more than it is not. And I think that we have to have these discussions, and I think that young adults especially, and I have a large adult readership too, they're ready and willing to have this discussion. And yeah.
Awesome. Well, I think it's a cool note to end on. We're going to get some audience questions in now. We have a microphone right over there. If anyone wants to ask, can line up.
I like to ask authors who they also read. So I know you mentioned Anne Rice, and I was wondering if you read Anne Roquelaire, but really wanted to ask, because you were talking about gender-neutral things, if anybody's read Elizabeth Lynn, who wrote in the 80s, and my favorite science fiction book is her A Different Sky.
That sounds awesome.
That does sound awesome.
Well, now I have. Now we have. We definitely have to pick it up.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. A big formative kind of a la your vampire experience, but a little bit earlier, the thing that made me fall in love with both reading and writing was the Lost Years of Merlin by T.A. Barron and that whole series. Oh yay, I love to see some love for T.A. Barron. It's lesser known, but it's this retelling of the Merlin myth, Merlin as a young boy discovering his identity, and it just completely transported me and made me fall in love with the written word.
Never heard of that before. That
It's
sounds
really good.
Sounds really good. Yeah, I mean, I think all writers have those things that we read super early on that just formed us into who we are and who we are as readers. For me, definitely Ella Enchanted, which is an amazing retelling of Cinderella that manages in a story where she really doesn't have a lot of agency in that retelling. She has so much, and she really makes these big decisions. And that was sort of an example of a character that I fell in love with, still to this day, one of my favorite characters, and those are the type of characters that I like to write.
So the book that got me sort of into the book that did the damage was Jeremy Thatcher Dragon Hatcher by Bruce Caudill. When I was homeschooled until 6th grade, and Wednesday was library day. And I checked that book out every single week until the librarian was finally just keep it, it's never here anyway. So, because I'd always check it out. So to this day, that book has just a special place in my heart. And one of the coolest career moments was when I got tweeted by him. I was like, you have no idea what you started. But I enjoyed Ray Bradbury as a young child. Of course, we had to read Fahrenheit 451, but I loved his writing style so much that I sort of chased down the rest of his works, and we would read short segments in some of our literature books, and I was like, I just love the way he writes. And so I read a lot of that, and I was brought up in a very, 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 very conservative household, so I was a bad girl in Red Harry Potter. Secretly, my neighbor was she was my hookup. She would sneak me. I would sneak over there and get the books, and so I actually got caught, and then I had to stop. But I had to wait till I moved out to go read the rest of them. So
The restraint.
and the spoilers, I know it was. But anyway, so those books kind of formed me as a young child who just fell in love with creating worlds and characters, and now as an adult, my tastes have really diversified a lot, and I have a 4-year-old, so I have to listen to a lot of stuff on Audible while I'm doing other things, but I really enjoyed The Martian. I couldn't remember the last time a book made me laugh that much. I love books that make me laugh. And I love Dan Brown books because it makes me feel like I just went on a really expensive European vacation. So those are the kinds of things I like to listen to. And when I'm reading for fun, I like to pick up, of course, YA books that I can just, go through and because if you read a Dan Brown book, you almost have to have Google over here because you're like, okay, where are they now? What is this museum? How do you say that word?
I need to see a picture of this painting. What is he talking about?
Right. Yeah. But those are kind of the books that have now are my thing. I've kind of started reading more in that. And I don't know if you guys have the same thing, but I can't read a book from the same genre I'm writing in because I'm like terrified of cross-contamination. So it's kind of forced me to read outside my comfort zone a little bit. So anyway.
Well, obviously Margaret Atwood, I can't speak. But I grew up reading everything, Edgar Allan Poe, a lot of the classics. My mother was really insistent upon it. So, Mary Shelley, but now Neil Gaiman, all over the place, Stephen King, you name it, I will read it, like Stephanie Lawrence, Quincy J. Allen, there's really nothing I won't read. You guys. I've been reading you, but I got to find you guys, so.
Yeah, I mean, as far as like books that were really influential, this is not original or unique at all, but Lord of the Rings, it was the first thing that I read. I read it in 5th grade, and I knew by that point that I wanted to be a writer, but it was the first high fantasy that I had ever read, the first thing where the author had completely created an entire universe and his own creatures, his own languages. I mean, everything was brand new, and I'd never seen that before, and so I felt like those books really opened my eyes to, as a writer, what you're capable of, the potential in using words to construct something in the reader's minds. It was very, very magical.
Next question.
So you talked about politics in your world. I was wondering, like religions, like if you have them, how you crafted them, just briefly.
This is a great question. In the very first draft of my book, I had sort of left out sort of anything about religion. And as I was revising it, I was like, actually, this book is kind of entirely about religion because it's about the belief in these prophets and who are now gone. And so there's sort of that like loss of faith and fall from grace for the whole world. And the main villain of the book is this sort of extremist religious sect that rises up in the wake of these prophets' absence.
I love to play with religions. I was raised at Georgia, South Georgia. Nicole, you can relate to this because one grandfather was a shaman, one granddaddy was a faith healing Baptist, and my grandmother was Catholic. That was the most fun. You did not want to be that in the 60s and 70s in South Georgia. So yeah, because I have a mixed heritage, grab bag of religion. Oh, and my godmother was Gullah, which those of you who've ever been to the coast of Georgia, that's kind of like a hoodoo kind of strange religion that's unto itself. So it was such a grab bag. I grew up at Fort Benning, so a lot of people who were around me were different religions. Like I had a friend who was Buddhist, and I like to explore them and be very respectful because it was such a neat, as a kid, I got to really interview all these different people, and my God, it's such a fascinating belief system. And my one granddaddy going, no, it ain't the Bible, honey. The Bible's the only thing you're gonna read. And then my other grandfather going, no, because he was very spiritual and very respectful. And he's like, well, in my religion, we don't really believe in a God. We have this higher, it would take me all day to explain. But anyway, so, when I'm writing, I like to really play around with looking at the different kinds of religions, especially in the League. We have entire religions that have their own Bibles, like the Book of Harmony for the Trezani. I've actually gone through and written the Book of Harmony so that my characters, when they quote it, they have their religious I can't say the word, iconography? I can never. Thank you. Let's hear it for somebody who is not dyslexic and they can get that word out. But yeah, so I go through and I create all their religious symbols, and I go through and do their mat because anybody who has a Catholic grandmother, no matter what else is in your family, you're Catholic. They have their mass. So yeah, I make sure that we do that for each and every character before I get started because we have to do that. And there are no snake handlings. Whatever I do, nobody handles a snake.
Next question.
So I'm a picture book author, and I'm graduating to middle grade, and I am a plotter, not a pantser, but any process advice you can give a new novelist?
If you plan on writing for kids, you really need to keep your pace fast, especially if you plan on gearing it more, like she was talking about, towards boys. And most readers enjoy a plot that moves, and with kids, they want action. My rule of thumb is if I'm bored, because I apparently have the writing maturity of a 12-year-old, if I'm bored writing it, my audience is going to be bored reading it. So blow something up, set something on fire. Rick Riordan was really good at that. And keep it moving, keep that plot going, add elements of humor, because kids love to laugh. I love to laugh. Most people like a spot of humor in a book, right? If you want that moment where everybody around you in the Starbucks or library is like, what are they laughing at? But so that would be my advice, I guess.
I would also, to sort of add on to that, I don't like the idea of so-called boy books or girl books, especially for kids. I think that it's really, really important to write a book that you think that any kid would like to read. I think that danger is sort of like what got us in a situation with respect to Kidlit specifically, where you have sections that are for Black children, you have sections that are for Asian children. You shouldn't be steering kids any which way when it comes to books. And we need to sort of, at the very beginning, eliminate this sort of bias that exists, especially with boys, that they're not allowed to enjoy certain types of books, or they're not allowed to read this. I think that you should write a book that you really, really enjoy reading yourself. And honestly, you're a picture book writer. We should be taking advice from you, because that, I have tried to write... Yeah, I have tried to write a picture book, and that's incredibly difficult to just, I have 90, 100, 110,000 words to get out what I'm thinking and how I'm feeling, especially with respect to a cast of characters. You have often like 250 words to get the same sort of message across and touch people in the same way. And I would just take what you do very well in picture books already and expand it for a middle grade audience, and really try to eliminate that notion that this is a book for a boy or this is a book for a girl.
I think also in terms of process, I can't speak to middle grade, but just moving from shorter fiction, for me, writing scripts into longer fiction, I found it very helpful to figure out whatever it is, a routine to help me kind of get into the writing zone for writing longer prose. So for me, it was like kind of figuring out the time of day that I can be really focused for 2 hours. And I personally do playlists to kind of get into a character's head, kind of finding a routine, and then being okay. This was an adjustment for me of I'm used to sort of sitting for 2 hours and getting an entire script done, and I found with my both the books that I've now written, sitting for 2 hours, I would get like not as much done because it's prose. So I think just figuring out that process for yourself as you go.
It's gonna happen.
Sorry.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, this question is for Lauren. I was wondering if you have any other fiction you read that you thought explored queer issues really well?
Queer issues? One of the books that I have not stopped thinking about for like 5 years is Jenny Nelson's I'll Give You the Sun. It's a really, really beautiful young adult novel about grief and sibling relationships, and a queer romance is part of it, but it just represents kind of discovering yourself and figuring things out in such a beautiful way. And also Simon versus the Homo Sapien Agenda, which Love, Simon is based on, is a wonderful book. Oh gosh, my entire mind is going blank. But Jenny Nelson's I'll Give You the Sun it's a stunningly written book.
And anything by Adam Silvera.
Yes, thank you.
Anything by
I would
Adam.
also add Caleb Rehrig, does wonderful YA, queer romance. We have some fans, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for being here, and thank you writers for talking.